All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jorge Acosta-Palmer, and I'm the director of the Statewide Training Initiative with Florida Legal Services. I also serve in the Executive Council of the Public Interest Law Section of the Florida Bar. We're excited to have you join us today for Advocacy in Action, Strategic Legal Tools for Human Trafficking Cases Involving Children. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. This training is being recorded, so if you registered, you're going to receive a copy of this recording via email from Zoom within about 24 hours. The email is going to include information about the CLE. It will also include a link to the materials that will be shared after the webinar is done. If you somehow miss registering, we will also be posting this recording on YouTube. So in the YouTube description, you will be able to find the CLE information, the description, the speakers, and the link to the materials as well. The training was approved by the Florida Bar for 1.5 General CLE, 1.5 Juvenile Law, 1.5 Criminal Appellate Law, and 1.5 Criminal Trial Law certification credit. So I will announce the CLE towards the end of the webinar. I'll drop it into the chat as well. And if for whatever reason you miss it, don't worry, because you're going to see it in the email that goes out from Zoom, and you can also find it in the YouTube description. Closed captions are enabled for anybody who needs them. So if you're having any issues with accessibility or the captions, you can reach out to me directly. And questions and answers. If you we have multiple segments as part of this presentation, so we have a lot of content and we have an hour and a half to get through it. So we're going to ask people to, if they have questions, you can post them in the Q&A. We'll monitor them to the best of our ability, but we will probably hold off until the end if time permits to answer questions. If for whatever reason we have some questions that are unanswered, feel free to email us and we'll coordinate with speakers to make sure that they have the ability, they can answer any unanswered questions. So with that said, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about our co-sponsors or co-host. In this case, this particular webinar has been organized by the FSU Children's Advocacy Clinic and the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar. So we're really grateful to FSU's Children's Advocacy Clinic for helping make today's training possible. This is led by Professor Paolo Annino and Emmeline Dalton. The clinic provides holistic legal representation to vulnerable children. I'm going to drop a link to the site for the clinic where you can find more information about the amazing work that they do. And when it comes to pills, you probably heard me talk about the public interest law section of the Florida Bar. I'm going to drop the link for our website into the chat as well, so you can learn more about our section. But before I do the usual plug, I'm actually going to pass it to Robin Rosenberg. She is with Florida Children's First, and she's also the chair of the Children's Rights Work Group. Robin, you're up.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us at the webinar today. This webinar came out of a discussion that the Children's Rights Work Group of the Public Interest Law section had about what gaps there were in the education of attorneys that represent or otherwise work with children. The Children's Rights section is formed to support each other's work within the bar in our work in representing children and families, and to advocate for improvements to the law for children. Membership in Pills is only $55. There's no additional cost to join the Children's Rights Work Group. Everyone is welcome. We value your input and your strategy, and it's just a great place to talk to colleagues about what you're working on and to get input from them. So if you're not already a member of Pills, please join. And if you are a member of Pills, let Jorge or I know that you want to join the Children's Rights Work Group. We meet monthly on the first Tuesday of the month. So next week, we would love to have you join us, get your input, and discover other areas where we can fill in gaps in sharing education and knowledge. So I am really pleased to turn it over to my colleague, Christine Smith, who, as a member of the section and then the Children's Rights Work Group, took on the task of organizing today's presentation. So thank you, Christine, for your work, and thanks everybody for being here today.
Thank you to our speakers. They're doing the heavy lifting today, and I will be moderating. Today we have FSU's clinic, Paolo Annino. He is the Glass Professor of the Public Interest Law at FSU College and a national leader in children's advocacy. He directs multiple projects serving vulnerable youth involving human trafficking and exploitation, and has spent decades advancing justice for children in healthcare, juvenile, and criminal legal systems. Paolo has also brought with him two FSU college students. Emma Smith is a 2L at FSU College. She's a student advocate at the FSU Children's Advocacy Clinic and is working alongside Professor Annino with the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Project. Also, we have Valerie Busto, who is also a 2L at FSU College. She also is a student advocate at the FSU Children's Advocacy Clinic and works along with Professor Paolo. And we also have joined with us Jacqueline Bradford, who is a senior supervising attorney with the Human Trafficking Project at Gulf Coast Legal Services, which is in Pinellas County. She has more than a decade of experience representing survivors of crime with a focus on labor trafficking and immigrant children seeking humanitarian and immigration relief. We also have Brent Woody joining us today, who is the founder and executive director of the Justice Restoration Center, where he provides free legal services to trafficking survivors since 2009. He's the leading advocate for survivor rights in Florida, including landmark laws on trafficking-related expungement and projections for exploited youth. So those are who we have speaking today. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Annino.
Welcome. Thank you for introducing us. My name again is Paolo Annino. I am the professor at FSU College of Law, and I direct the HELP project, Human Trafficking Exploitation Law Project. In that project, we handle approximately 40 traffic cases at any one time. So we have a number of years of experience representing trafficked children. I'm really excited to be here today to share some important information about human trafficking and about what you can do in the audience to really make a change in our state. So first I want to talk about data, information. For the longest time, we did not have adequate data telling us how many children do we have in the state of Florida that are actually being trafficked. For years, that was been a big issue. And what we had for years was the Florida legislature, through something called OPPAGA, OPPAGA, issued an annual report dealing with sex trafficking of children and came out like this past year with 379 children were sex trafficked, verified sex trafficked in 2024. And 379 children is outrageous alone. But everyone in the field and all the social scientists all said that that number is grossly underrepresenting what's really happening in the state of Florida. Finally, the Florida legislature funded University of South Florida to do a major study and provided University of South Florida all of the state data on human trafficking of children from Department of Juvenile Justice, Department of DCF, and Department of Health, etc. So we finally had comprehensive data on human trafficking, and the results came out this past July. The results are just shocking, and that is we have 225,000 children in Florida who are being trafficked. 100,000 are being trafficked, are being sex trafficked, and 125,000 are being labor trafficked. Truthfully, that's just shameful that we have this in Florida. And this population, as we're going to talk about shortly, needs help with a multitude of different legal issues. So we're happy everyone here in the audience is here to help this population of 225,000 children. Okay. Next slide, please. Yep. Who are trafficked children? From my perspective, I look at trafficked children, the children we represent, as really as the saddest of the sads. They are children who are exploited. And that's a key concept when we talk about trafficked children. They're exploited children. And they're being exploited for two reasons. Sometimes they're overlapping reasons. And that is they're being exploited for sex and they're being exploited for labor. And sometimes for both. So they're exploited children being exploited for sex and or labor, and they're being exploited by a trafficker. Now, when we talk about trafficked children, there's a professor at Florida State University, Terry Coonan, and he always states correctly that there is no iconic trafficked child, and he's correct on that. There's all backgrounds of trafficked children. But we do find there are some similarities between trafficked children. We'll talk about those in a minute. So we have traffickers, and there are different types of traffickers also. At the help clinic, what we find with our, say, 40 cases or so, the majority of the traffickers are family members. They're family members, mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, stepfathers, step-grandfathers. So we find that. So there's also sometimes in the media, thinking about these trafficked children are from Eastern Europe who are being trafficked. Well, at least in Florida, what we have when we talk about sex trafficking, at least, these are local children. These are children in our very own communities who are being trafficked. So what you have then is exploited children for sex and or labor by traffickers and for commercial gain. The traffickers are doing it. Commercial gain is another way of saying money, money, money. And as we'll talk about shortly, that there is, large amounts of money being made in trafficking of children. Trafficking involves recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, obtaining, a number of characteristics that trafficking have. But the main point I want to get across is when we talk about children, we're talking about exploitation, and we're talking for the purpose of sex or labor. Next slide, please. So from the point of view of the traffickers look at children as reusable commodities. Many traffickers are simply drug dealers on the streets, and they prefer to traffic children because, unlike drugs, which is a commodity that gets expended once used, children can be used and used and used. One of our clients, and I'm changing the name, I'm going to call the client Sally. Sally was trafficked 10 times a day. 10 times a day. So again, the trafficker makes huge amounts of money with these children because they're constantly being used and used and used. So what you have is the traffickers making money off children. You have the child, and then you have either the sex buyer or the labor buyer. So those are the three major dynamics here for at least for trafficking. Next slide, please. So what is common among all trafficked children? So what's common among all trafficked children? Vulnerability, vulnerability, vulnerability. Now, there might be different reasons why they're vulnerable. So some trafficked children are vulnerable because they have psychiatric disorders. Some are vulnerable because they have emotional disorders. Some have cognitive deficits, and that's why they're vulnerable. Some are vulnerable because of extreme poverty, and that's what the source of their vulnerability is: extreme poverty. So it varies from child to child, the source of vulnerability. Another source of vulnerability, I want to say, is sexual abuse, and that's one of the grounds why they're vulnerable. But even if a child does not have one of those grounds I just mentioned, they're children, and just by being children, their brain is not fully developed. And the part of the brain we're talking about is the part that deals with judgment. And that part of the brain is one of the last parts that get developed. And that's in the early 20s. So 19, 20, 21 years old. And so making judgments is more challenging for children. Okay. Next, please. So when we talk about trafficking of children, there is our federal law, Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the year 2000. And it really, I just want to say real quickly on that, the year 2000 was one of those amazing years in world history, because that's the year where finally human trafficking was recognized, was finally defined. And what you're going to see for adults when it comes to human trafficking, you're going to see that the phrase fraud, force, and coercion are a key element to establish trafficking for adults. So fraud, force, or coercion are key elements for adults. For children, those are not key elements. So when it comes to state law, and state law follows the federal law and make for adults that requires fraud, force, or coercion for the purpose of exploitation based on sex or on labor. But for children, Florida law is real clear. Children cannot consent to trafficking. So next slide, please. Yes, children cannot consent to trafficking. So because they cannot consent under Florida law, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion to establish sex trafficking. And also when it comes to labor trafficking in Florida, again, you do not have to prove force, or coercion. So in summary, in Florida, we have 225,000 children who are being trafficked. And we have the beginning now with this data to address it. And the next speaker is Emma Smith, and Emma will be talking about the services that can be provided to these children. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Like Professor Annino said, my name is Emma Smith. I'm a 2L student advocate with the Human Trafficking Project at the law school. So when we talk about services, there is an important distinction that needs to be made. And this is whether the survivor falls under the scope of DCF care or whether the child falls under the community children umbrella. So first things first, the children that fall under the DCF care, we call them dependent children. These are verified survivors of human trafficking who are under the care of the Department of Children and Families, that's DCF. Now, on the other hand, we have community children, and these are also verified victims of trafficking, but they're not in the foster care system, meaning they didn't receive in-home or out-of-home services at the time or within 6 months of their verification as a survivor. Now, even though they're not in the system as the traditional sense, they're not left entirely on their own. Each of these community children is given a support plan where they're assigned a caseworker who checks in on them periodically. Now, in 2024, 67% of all of the verified human trafficking children, I'll also interchangeably refer to them as CSE victims, commercially sexually exploited victims. So 67% of those were community children. So how is a child verified as a survivor of human trafficking? And I think you can probably go to the next slide. So when a referral is made, the Department of Children and Family Services, alongside community-based care, which is another agency, and typically a multidisciplinary team will assess the child using a level of care placement tool. Now, this tool looks at several different things, specifically child's history, things like past psychiatric needs, substance abuse, or whether the child has a habit of running away. Now, the results from this placement tool result in one of three specific types of housing placements. And this is at-risk homes, safe foster homes, and safe houses. So first I'll talk about the at-risk homes. These are reserved for those individuals suspected of being trafficked or present what we call red flags of being trafficked. These red flags can include history of running away, past sexual abuse, or past a pattern of being bounced around between different foster homes. These at-risk homes are the most prevalent type of housing and offer the most availability. Every region in Florida offers one, and currently there's a total of 187 at-risk homes in the state of Florida. Next, we've got the safe foster homes. And these are not your average foster homes. They've been designed for children who have been verified as CSE victims. They are family-based environments, meaning the child lives in a traditional home setting with foster parents. But the foster parents for these safe foster homes are required to undergo some extensive training focused specifically on CSE. Currently, there's 28 safe foster homes scattered across Florida. You can go to the next slide. So finally, we come to safe houses, and these were created through the 2012 Safe Harbor Act. They're state-certified group homes designed specifically for confirmed victims of human trafficking, and their primary goal is safety, safety from the traffickers. And so to prevent these traffickers from tracking down their victims, the locations of these homes are strictly confidential. They also offer 24-hour awake supervision as well as on-site trauma therapy, which I'll get into that here later. Now, these safe houses typically have a low capacity, only housing about 4 children at a time, and currently there's only 8 of them across the whole state of Florida. So when there is 100,000 trafficked kids, like Professor Annino said, 8 safe houses aren't going to be enough. Now, community children, if their individual circumstances warrant that level of care, they do have access to placement in these safe houses. In fact, according to like the most recent DCF report, 30% of all safe house residents fall into this category of what we call community kids. So I mentioned briefly trauma therapy, so I'm going to get into that a little bit. So as Professor Annino mentioned, human trafficking victims generally have common issues that they have going on with them, and I think they're located on the slide. So to combat these symptoms, trauma therapy uses specialized techniques that go beyond traditional talk therapy. And so while regular talk therapy focuses on a person's current day-to-day issues and immediate concerns, trauma therapy is designed to be specifically responsive to a victim's experiences. It allows them to process deep-rooted trauma that manifests as PTSD, depression, anxiety, shame, and sometimes therapists use practical tools to help manage symptoms to kind of show how their physical health and mental health are linked. And then in some extreme cases, they use some other specific methods that are generally uncommon in regular therapy, such as like EMDR, which I won't get into, but it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Now I'm kind of gonna flip the switch. You can go to the next slide and talk about some financial resources that human trafficking victims have access to. So in addition to housing and therapy, Florida provides financial assistance to victims through the Crime Victim Compensation Program. This is a fund designed to help crime victims, not just human trafficking. But within this program, there's a provision that does specifically provide relocation assistance to victims of human trafficking. And under that statute, there's several requirements. Generally the law allows for a one-time emergency payment of up to $1,500 to help a victim move to a safe environment away from their trafficker. And then they also allow a lifetime maximum of $3,000. Now, there's several statutory requirements, but just in general, one, there's got to be clear evidence that the trafficking even occurred. The crime must have been reported to the police. Applications for the funding must have been made within 3 years, although there are some good cause exceptions to that. And lastly, a local domestic violence or rape crisis center must certify that the victim is working with the police and that there's a safety plan in place for that person. So this all sounds great, right? But in reality, it's not quite so. In the 2023-24 fiscal year, there were 6 applications for compensation from CSE victims, only 6. And one of them was for the Human Trafficking Relocation Fund. And 4 of them were actually found to be legally eligible, but not a single one of those only 4 applicants that were eligible, not a single one of them got any funds. They weren't paid out. Now, there is a phone number that's available to call and get more information as to how these services can be provided. But since I've got minimal time, I'll just drop it in the chat when I'm done. So you can go to the next slide. I'm just going to briefly go over one more thing, which is the Department of Juvenile Justice. So the connection between exploitation and delinquency is incredibly high. The main thing that the DJJ does is screen kids that come into the center using a human trafficking screening tool. It's an assessment designed in 2015 by a partnership between DCF and the DJJ. Now, the data shows that at least 25% of all verified victims of human trafficking in Florida end up in a DJJ detention center or a residential commitment program within just 1 year of being identified as a verified victim of human trafficking. Now, as I mentioned, there's 2 paths that they usually go to: detention centers and residential commitment centers or facilities. The detention centers are where children stay as they wait for court hearings. The time that they stay there is generally short, about 13 days. On average. They do offer basic services, mental health, substance abuse, things of that nature. Now, if a child is adjudicated delinquent, that would be guilty, I guess, in adult court, they might be moved to a residential commitment program. This is a much longer commitment. The average stay is about 9 months. And because the child's there for a longer period of time, there are more services available. But again, out of all of the services that the DJJ offer, none of them are specifically tailored to victims of CSE. This was addressed in 2020. The Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability, I know that's a mouthful, also known as APAGA, recommended that the DJJ implement a curriculum specifically for trafficking prevention and recovery. However, even though they said they were addressing it as of April of last year, 2025, those programs still don't exist. Now, the DJJ does sometimes offer outside clinicians or survivor mentors to visit the children, but these survivor mentors often face difficulty getting into the residential programs because the DJJ might have security policies or background checks that in place that prevent them from, entering. So I guess ultimately there seems to be a lot of good. There's a lot of variety in these services, but there just doesn't seem to be a lot of availability or ability on the part of providers to ensure these children are able to get what they desperately need. But now I'm going to hand it off to Valerie. Thanks you guys for listening, and I will drop that phone number in the chat.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Valerie Busto. As I said, I'm a 2L at Florida State Law School. So when people think about human trafficking, especially child trafficking, they often imagine like an FBI bust or a Diddy Epstein level federal prosecution. But in reality, most attorneys who end up working with trafficked youth don't go looking for those cases. They encounter them throughout everyday legal work. So in juvenile court, dependency court, or community referrals. So often without realizing that trafficking is involved at all. So today I want to talk about community outreach in a practical way, where attorneys actually encounter trafficked children, how those cases reach us, and how trauma-informed advocacy can change outcomes. So I'll focus on 3 main entry points: runaway and youth shelters, juvenile public defender offices, and then dependency court through either Department of Children and Families or the Guardian ad litem program. So one of the most common entry points for trafficked youth is runaway and youth shelters. A lot of people don't realize what these shelters are, how they operate. In Florida, there's approximately 28 runaway and homeless youth shelters, most of which are funded through the Federal Street Outreach Program, or SOP. So these programs exist specifically to serve youth who are homeless, runaway, or at high risk of exploitation. So a local example in Tallahassee is Capital City Youth Services, or CCYS, which provides emergency shelter, outreach services, and case management for youth who are living in extremely unstable situations. So across Florida, these SOP-funded programs conduct street outreach. They provide short-term shelter, connect youths to the counseling and case management services Emma talked about, and served as one of the first points of contact for trafficked children. So these kids are among the highest risk populations for trafficking. However, a lot of them have histories of abuse, neglect, and obviously housing instability. So exploitation often happens within 24 to 72 hours after a child runs away. But this part is pretty important. Running away doesn't cause trafficking, vulnerability does. So in shelters, trafficking rarely looks like a child asking for help. More often, it looks like an older, controlling boyfriend or girlfriend, a child returning with money or gifts, but they don't have any explanation for it, fear of law enforcement or authority figures, inconsistent stories about where they've been, and or resistance to services or placement. So one of the biggest challenges is that a child obviously rarely identifies himself as trafficking victims, if they even know what trafficking is. So they might feel loyalty to the trafficker, they fear consequences, they can feel shame, or probably the worst, in my opinion, they simply just view the situation as normal. So if they're still in the community and living in shelters, their traffickers still have access to them. And this is where attorneys can make a real impact. Through community outreach, lawyers can build relationships with shelter staff so that they can refer their clients to you for legal services. Lawyers can give presentations to the shelters, to the kids living there on legal topics like knowing your rights or some basic criminal procedure that everyone should know, and help staff recognize red flags so that they can understand when legal intervention is appropriate. So the goal is not to turn shelter staff into investigators. It's to help them know when to pick up the phone and call a lawyer. So this brings me to my next point. Another major entry point for trafficked youth is the juvenile justice system. Public defenders especially represent children all the time charged with truancy, runaway offenses, petty theft or survival crimes, probation violations, and drug-related offenses tied to instability. But these cases are often masking trafficking. One recent case from our clinic illustrates this pretty well, I think. We had a teenage girl who was arrested alongside adult men and was charged with drug possession. So nothing in the charging document reflected trafficking concerns. She was initially treated as a delinquent before anyone considered her a victim when she entered GJJ. But the public defender assigned to her case recognized some red flags and that she had previously been a client with the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center here in Tallahassee, or STAC. So the PD referred the case to our clinic. We worked with the state attorney's office and advocated against commitment post-adjudication. So instead, the child agreed to placement in a safe house, like Emma talked about, where she could receive trauma-informed care and therapy and get a second chance. So that outcome, safe housing instead of commitment, happened because the public defender recognized trafficking indicators. There was communication between multiple disciplinary offices, and the case was approached with a trauma-informed victim lens. So public defenders are pretty critical in that sense because they're often the first consistent adult a child trusts. People have an inclination to tell everything to their lawyer, and their lawyer can be the first person to hear a full story of a child's life, and then they can recognize coercion. So public defenders are in a position to advocate for diversion, push for services instead of detention, raise competency and voluntariness concerns, and then, of course, connect the youth to trauma-informed care away from the Department of Juvenile Justice. And while Florida does not prosecute minors for prostitution, trafficking often first appears through other charges, which makes defense counsel essential to identifying victims early. So lastly for today, another critical entry point is dependency court through DCF and guardian ad litem. Children in the dependency system often experience all the vulnerabilities that can lead to exploitation. So placement instability, prior abuse and neglect, disrupted attachments, and high risk of running away. These are the exact vulnerabilities traffickers exploit. And in dependency cases, trafficking presents itself like it does in runaway shelters. So think repeatedly running from foster homes, sometimes sudden behavioral changes. They might have older friends or family members providing gifts or monies or cell phones and refusing to disclose whereabouts. So too often, these behaviors are mischaracterized as defiance disorders, rather than signs of exploitation and survival tactics. So this is where Florida law becomes especially important. In 2014, the Florida legislative enacted Florida Statute 39.01305, subsection 3, which is a mouthful, which requires appointment of counsel for certain children in dependency proceedings, including children who are victims of human trafficking. This statute is a huge deal because it recognizes trafficking victims as a legally distinct, vulnerable population and then ensures access to counsel. So we can create an opportunity for early advocacy as attorneys. A child who has been trafficked has a right to an attorney under the Florida statute. That attorney can advocate for trauma therapy, safe housing, appropriate placement, and services that address exploitation rather than punishment. And importantly, private attorneys can be appointed under the statute. If attorney puts their name on the list, a judge can call them to represent these kids. And just making yourself available shows the court, and I think more importantly, the child, that someone cares and wants to help. Guardian ad litems play a crucial role here because they can see those patterns over time. They're not law enforcement. They don't represent the state. They represent the child, and they often build trust more easily. So with training, guardian ad litems can recognize grooming, ask trauma-informed questions, advocate for therapy and safe placement, or work with those appointed attorneys in the community that are triggered under referrals from the statute. So I'll close with this. The common thread across all of these systems is this: trafficked youth, they're already there. The challenge is not finding them, it's recognizing them. You don't need to be a trafficking expert to make a difference. You just have to care enough to understand how trauma presents, knowing where these cases arise, most likely, and building relationships across systems. So we need more attorneys who are willing to step up. So apply to accept trafficking related appointments, apply for the victim compensation funds for your client from the federal government. It's money that's sitting there to be used, partner with shelters, advocate for trauma-placed placements, and push for safe housing instead of detention. We have 100,000 kids who are trafficking survivors in Florida and only a handful of safe placements. The solution is not sending these kids back into the community where their traffickers operate until they're in a place where their vulnerabilities aren't subject to exploitation as badly. So the solution is for lawyers to step forward and use a tool that the law already gives us and advocate for children who cannot advocate for themselves. And that's how we change outcomes. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about immigration needs and immigration solutions for children in care and survivors of human trafficking. Due to time and also the complexity of the topic, my goal is to share high-level information. The slides were written geared towards children's attorneys, but really this is the information. I would describe this as baseline information that absolutely everyone who participates in the child welfare system in any role needs to have, just for taking on any case. If you are ever involved in a case that does involve a child with an immigration need, you will need more information to be able to, knowledge to be able to successfully fulfill your duties with respect to that child. But this is going to be sort of the baseline information that you need to be able to determine whether or not a child even has an immigration need to begin with. Yes, please seek more information if you're ever on a case. So I want to start with the good news, which is that most children in the child welfare system either already have an immigration status or are eligible for an immigration status. Many children will be eligible for multiple immigration benefits. So this is absolutely wonderful news. This is great. However, it comes with a lot of challenges, and we have to be aware of these challenges. So even for children who already have an immigration status, action is needed to preserve that status, and what those individual actions are will depend on the details of that child's specific case. And then for children who need to obtain a status, either because their current status is expiring or they don't currently have a status, Again, action is needed to apply for status and also to prevent deportation orders. We cannot tell who has an immigration need by looking at them, even by talking with them, right? Because children may or may not understand what an immigration status is, what their immigration status is. They certainly very rarely understand the full scope of obligations and requirements to keep and maintain a status or to apply for a status, what they're eligible for, right? That's the role of the folks who are assisting them and of their caregivers and guardians. And so when a child is in care, that is now the role of the system to make sure that these needs are met and fulfilled. It's also important to know that we can't tell whether any individual child has an urgent deadline, right? They could have a deadline that they're facing tomorrow. A deadline could have passed last week, right? So until we know the details about the case, we should presume the child could be facing an urgent deadline, urgent action could be needed. And also some children will need assistance across multiple agencies. So there's multiple deadlines potentially to track. So that's just why there's a lot of challenges and things can be very time sensitive. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so what are our responsibilities? Well, the child's attorney, but also really the only difference here is that the child's attorney is acting consistent with the child's wishes for everything, right? Pretty much everyone else on the case, parents, attorneys are really the only ones who may or may not have these responsibilities depending on, right, the parents' goals and priorities. But really everyone else on the case has responsibility to seek appropriate services for the child. And so when we're looking at what are the tasks for a child's attorney who does not have immigration expertise, right? Presuming you yourself are not going to be the one who's working on the immigration case, these are the tasks that you need to keep track of. 1, identify whether the child has an immigration need. 2, take action to ensure the need is met through immigration legal services. 3, ensure the immigration attorney has needed information and records. And 4, ensure the child receives the needed services. Now, what actions, what level of advocacy will be required for all of these tasks to be completed will vary by case. Sometimes you're lucky enough to have an experienced case manager on the case. Maybe the guardian ad litem, they know all about this topic. Everyone's on it. Everyone's paying attention. The judge is checking in, right? It all goes smoothly. And all you have to do is, ask questions, make sure things are progressing. Of course, unfortunately, that's not going to happen in the majority of cases. What you need to do will depend on folks' reactions to your requests, advocacy, what folks' level of knowledge is, right? So you're just going to be following up, making sure advocating is necessary, and sometimes, requesting judicial orders if needed. So yes, sometimes completing these tasks, even when you're not the one who's actually performing the immigration services, can be pretty complex. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so it's very important. Step 1, identifying whether there's an immigration need. We need to do that as soon as possible. By statute, and seeking services as soon as possible. By statute, it's mandated that immigration needs shall be identified when a child is adjudicated dependent, right? So if the need is on folks' radar at all, they might be thinking of it as a requirement for the dependency stage. However, if we wait, this risks irreparable harm, right? Because until we know the details of the child's case and circumstances, we don't know if they have an urgent deadline. And if we miss a deadline, we risk irreparable harm. So that's why, to protect the child's interests, immigration needs must be evaluated immediately, right? And I want to also note that even though this should be like a day 1, day 2 immediate concern, it's important never to presume. If you come in on a case, let's say you're appointed to a case 2-3 years in, this is still step 1. Does the child have an immigration need, right? Go through the steps. Have the needs been met? Because unfortunately, they can fall through the cracks, right? So whether you come onto a case the day the child is sheltered or whether you come onto a case 3 years later, we need to go through all of the steps, make sure that they have all been taken care of. Next slide, please. So how do we know if a child has an immigration need? So if a child is not a U.S. citizen and they do not have proof of U.S. citizenship, they should be referred to an immigration attorney. The best practice is if a child was born outside of the United States, connect the child with an immigration attorney immediately. Now, children who are born outside the United States could be U.S. citizens. However, determining whether or not they have the documentation that they need to prove they're a U.S. citizen now, and also, to move forward successfully in life in the future, right? Like to be able to work, to be able to get a driver's license, etc. That can be a complex determination. So that's why even for kids who may already be U.S. citizens, it's best, unless you have that immigration expertise, to make sure they're referred to an immigration attorney. And then if a child should have been born in the United States, but we don't actually have that birth certificate on file, we also want to make sure we get that U.S. birth certificate as soon as possible. So for purposes of determining whether or not the child needs to be referred to an immigration attorney, a copy is probably sufficient. But I would encourage everyone on every case that they're on to make sure that the child, even if they are a U.S. citizen, has their identity documents. Lack of identity documents is common for kids in care in general, and especially for survivors of human trafficking. And so we want to make sure that the kids or caregivers have not just a copy, but the actual original documents before any case is closed out, because it can be sort of, unfortunately, a catch-22, right? You need documents to get documents. And so the last thing we want is to close a case out, and then a child, especially as they become like an older teen or they turn 18, and they realize they don't know how to get their documents. And once they try, it's going to be a time-consuming process frequently. So we want to make sure kids have kids or caregivers have hard copies of those birth certificates and also social security cards, even if the kid is a U.S. citizen. Next slide, please. Okay, so we figure out that there is an immigration need, right? We're going to refer the kid. What does that mean for the kid? Well, it depends on the individual circumstances, because there could be a wide range of needs. Some children might just need advice. It might be relatively simple. However, again, action is frequently needed to maintain status. So it's important for them to get that advice so that they can follow it, and their caregivers can follow it right on their behalf. But other children might need full representation in multiple cases, and it might be complex and lengthy case. Children born outside the United States may have any type of immigration status, and we don't want to presume, right? Kids could be U.S. citizens. Kids could be legal permanent residents. They could have a temporary status. They could have no current status. And what is needed, the scope of the need, will vary depending on that child's individual status and history. It's super important for children, caregivers, and case managers to know the rules that apply to each child's immigration status and to make sure the status is maintained. And that can be especially challenging if there are turnover for case managers or, there are multiple placements. So we need to keep on that if we're the attorney, also for another party of the case like guardian ad litem or CLS. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some of the options for kids who do not already have a permanent immigration status? Children who've experienced trafficking may be eligible for lots of different kinds of statuses. Some of the most common ones are T visas for survivors of trafficking specifically, U visas for survivors of crime, including trafficking crimes, and special immigrant juvenile status. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give some highlights about the different options, not expecting you to learn any of these details, but to help you have an idea of why, especially, for example, if you're a children's attorney or how the immigration attorney is going to operate, we need to be able to give the children options, and we need to, of course, listen and learn about the children's priorities and preferences to help to give them advice about what option might be best for them And of course, the children are going to make the decision about what to apply for. Generally speaking, unless they're very, very young, because they're going to sign their own forms if they are 14 or older. And also immigration attorneys are going to represent the children directly. Okay, so if for a T visa, generally the trafficking has to have occurred in the United States. There are some circumstances where trafficking abroad could make someone eligible, but generally speaking, in the United States, minors are not required to report their victimization to law enforcement. However, they do have to write a personal statement or, verbally someone can help them write it to explain what happened and to talk about their trafficking victimization. So this can be a barrier for some kids where they don't want to have to disclose to the government all the details of their trafficking victimization. If they submit the application and they are approved, they'll receive employment authorization. A full approval is a status for 4 years. There is an interim approval stage called a bona fide determination, and that would come with a work permit while they're waiting for the full adjudication of their application. And then here's an example of a situation where a child will have an urgent deadline that they have to comply with. So, for example, a child who has their T visa, they'll have it for 4 years. Before their status expires, they must apply for legal permanent residence or they will lose their status. They won't have any status anymore. So this is one of those examples of a deadline that has to be met, or the child can face, severe harm, and the child might not be aware themselves of this deadline. Usually 3 years after the approval is when the child can apply for legal permanent residence. And then just a quick note for another type of benefit that is not an immigration status. It's called an OTIP letter, Office of Trafficking in Persons, with Health and Human Services. It's a letter that can be applied for anyone who's under 18 and has experienced trafficking anywhere in the world, and it provides access to public benefits. This is super important because generally immigrants are not eligible for most public benefits, and the letters don't expire. So even after the child becomes an adult, it maintains their eligibility. Next slide, please. Okay, so for survivors of crime. So again, this includes the crime of trafficking, and there are certain reasons why it might be a better fit for certain children. The crime has to have occurred in the United States or violated U.S. law. But for this one, the child themselves doesn't have to write the personal statement. It can be written by someone else on their behalf if they're 16 or under. Also, the crime does have to be reported to law enforcement, and someone has to be helpful, but they can do it on behalf of the child as well, again, if the child is 16 or under. This one does require a certification to be filled out regarding the crime and helpfulness, and that can be filled out by federal, state, or local law enforcement, a prosecutor, a judge, or other authorities with responsibility to investigate and prosecute that type of crime. Unfortunately, it is a very long wait to get the full status, but it takes about 2 years to get an interim decision called a bona fide determination, and that can come with a work permit. Okay, next slide, please. And then the last status is special immigrant juvenile status, at least the last status I'm discussing today. Again, children can be eligible for all sorts of statuses depending on their individual circumstances. So this is for children who've experienced abuse, abandonment, or neglect. It does not require that the child disclose victimizations. It does allow to legal permanent residence, but unfortunately it's a very long wait at this time. In order to be able to apply, sorry, I was seeing the comments. In order to be able to apply, it does require a state court order, and the order has to include findings and factual bases for each of the topics. And the immigration agency that processes these can be pretty particular about the language. So it's important for an immigration attorney to be involved in reviewing proposed orders and making sure that all of the language is written in the way that USCIS, which is the agency that processes these, likes it to be. In the past, kids received deferred action. Usually with this status, at this time, it's not happening. There is ongoing litigation about that, so it could change in the future. But this is still a status that's appropriate for most kids in the child welfare system, as long as they're not going to be reunified with both parents. They can be reunified with one parent and they can still be eligible for the status. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, So, as I alluded to before, it's important to remember that kids who are immigrants and immigrants in general, so anyone who is not a US citizen, will have responsibilities for life until they become a US citizen. So it's really important, children and adults, but I'm talking about children here, right? They have to follow all of the rules for their status. And if they don't know their rules or the caregiver doesn't know the rules, that's going to be very difficult, right? And honestly, some of them require proactive action. So it's not going to happen unless they know. So it's really important for everyone to have the information about the child's status, about the rules the children have to follow, and to regularly consult with an immigration attorney to be aware of any changes. Now, how often someone needs to consult with an immigration attorney depends on their individual status. So that's a question that should be asked. And then I would follow, the advice of the attorney, and or there's certain websites that provide updates that folks can look at as well. We always want to make sure that before anyone brings a child anywhere, they've consulted with an attorney, at least in the past, to see, is travel safe for this child? In the past, we would focus on travel outside of the United States, which is usually not an option for many people unless they have their legal permanent residence. Now, even travel within the United States is something we should seek advice about. So this can be very challenging because especially if no one has identified the child has an immigration need, right? This is not on the radar of the foster family. Families like to go on trips. So it's really important for everyone to be aware of what's best for the child and what's required for the immigration status. It's also really important for everyone to consult with an immigration attorney. If there's any involvement with delinquency system, any criminal justice involvement, if immigration documents are lost, or if either the status or the documents are within 1 year of expiring. So there's lots of circumstances where we need follow-up with immigration attorneys. And on the next page, I think we're going to hold questions for the end, but I have listed a few trusted organizations that have a lot of wonderful resources where you can learn more. And as I mentioned, you can feel free to reach out to me if you ever want to chat about a topic.
Hi, good afternoon. Brent Woody with the Justice Restoration Center. Or hey, if you can just move on to slide probably 47, something like that, starting with the issue. Today, we want to talk a little bit about criminal record expungement, and obviously a critical area for individuals that have been trafficked. And much of this you'll be familiar with, but the issue is trafficking victims often, in fact, a majority of the time, especially in sex trafficking scenarios, come out of the life with a criminal record. So prostitutions charges, drug charges, theft crimes, person-on-person crimes, a lot of criminal traffic, even human trafficking, other financial crimes, that sort of thing. Go ahead to the next slide there. The consequences of a criminal record, we all are familiar with them: employment, housing, education, family law situations, social situations, immigration, potentially a big impact on immigration, as adults volunteering at a child's school, various things like that, and then voting, gun ownership, things like that basic rights. Go ahead to that next slide. I'm going to kind of come at this in terms of expunging adult records, but it's really the same process for juvenile records as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the impact of those juvenile records in a little bit. But obviously, trafficking victims can get stuck in a cycle, right? So they're trafficked, they're arrested, they maybe exit, and again, thinking about adults, exit that exploitation, overnight or for a period of time. Then they get out. but maybe they're addicted, they get clean, they can't get hired, they can't find housing, and essentially end up with a lack of meaningful choices. So they're vulnerable again to re-exploitation. And then they're arrested again. So we have clients that have had one client as many as I think 54 cases in a single county, just because it was a revolving door. Go ahead, next slide. So the non-legal consequences of a criminal record: stigma, shame, being re-traumatized every time you have to visit that record, like when you apply for a job or get in a situation where that record's going to become relevant. Just trauma triggers generally, family relationships where the family doesn't really, extended family or immediate family doesn't even understand how you got involved in that criminal activity. And then social, just friendships. And there's a lot of other non-legal consequences as well. Next slide. I have like a million slides, so we're gonna go through these as quickly as we can. In 2013, we passed Section 943.0583, which is a statute that gives a human trafficking survivor who's been criminalized as a result of their trafficking. They can petition a court to expunge any and all of the record that resulted from human trafficking. So it was passed in 2013, enacted in 2014. Our first expungement was in 2014, and it's been amended through the years to kind of fix the things that we maybe overlooked at the beginning. So go ahead, the next slide. So just a warning, and I think I maybe caught a question in the chat there, that there are other kinds of expungements in Florida, and we call them traditional or regular expungements under a couple of other statutes. And those do have limitations, like only one, and you can't do one if there's a conviction and that sort of thing. And I just want to be clear that the human trafficking expungement statute has none of those limitations. So you can expunge as many charges as, again, that resulted from trafficking. Really important features of human trafficking expungement is that it vacates any related conviction, anything that's associated with that record, which is incredible. It's a vacature on the merits. So it's a substantive vacature. Eliminates all the fines, probation, even incarceration, because it just wipes it out. And the other advantage is you only have to disclose these arrests in only 2 instances. So, which is if you're a defendant in a future case, which we'll hope you're not, and if you're applying for a position with law enforcement. So. Go ahead to the next slide there. So just quickly, the process, and this makes it look like this is just a bullet point process, but this is can be an unwieldy process, can be very, very complex. Determining eligibility for human trafficking expungements is going to be information gathering. If you're working with a child that's been verified, maybe that's going to be limited, or there may be things already in the file. And the information that you have that will sort of reduce the need to do a deep dive with your client. You have to determine where to file, and preparing pleadings and the like, and filing the petition package. No FDLE certificate is required. This is not an FDLE related process, at least on the front end. So go ahead to the next slide. So the eligibility, kind of straightforward. The petitioner must have been a victim of human trafficking. It must be an eligible offense, and there must have been a nexus to the arrest or the conviction. And you have to petition with due diligence. And due diligence is basically sometime after you're no longer a victim, and or after, seeking services and that sort of thing. That's a pretty nebulous standard. It's never been an issue because honestly, some survivors don't understand that they may be eligible for that until 30 years after their trafficking, and it could be they just didn't know about it. So there are a lot of reasons why a delay could occur. Go ahead to that next slide. I know there's been a little bit of discussion about who is a victim of human trafficking, and so again, under the statute, a victim of human trafficking is defined as somebody who was a victim under either state or federal law. So it's a pretty broad, much broader than if it was just limited to one or the other. Go ahead. Let's go ahead to the next slide because I think that's probably information that people have. And even the next one, if you would. Thank you. I do want to point out that under federal law, this isn't often talked about, but under federal law, actually any adult who is involved in prostitution as a prostituted individual is a victim of sex trafficking. Now, it's not a severe form of human trafficking, but it is defined as sex trafficking, and it would come under our expungement statute. So something to keep in mind. Again, not often discussed. Go ahead to that next slide. Florida and federal distinctions, and there certainly are some. Federal sex trafficking generally requires some kind of sexual contact, whereas in Florida, you can have sexual performances, videotape, CSAM, that sort of thing, and consistent again with what the professor was talking about, where child victims don't require any sort of coercion. So any child that's in a strip club, that's involved in any sort of, again, CSAM, that sort of thing is by definition a human trafficking victim. Whether or not they've been verified, of course, if people know they're involved in these things, they would be, but even if they weren't. So, again, Professor mentioned this, federal child labor trafficking does require force, fraud, or coercion. Florida child labor trafficking does not require coercion. And many times in these cases, and especially on the adult side, there's an intersection almost always between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So really important to keep that in mind, where you might have a sex trafficking situation, but the traffickers forcing them to carry their drugs or drive them to that sort of thing without a driver's license, so on and so forth. Those are labor trafficking instances, and the law in Florida does acknowledge under the Williams v. State case, which I think was cited earlier, that even if it's criminal activity that they engage in, it is a form of labor trafficking. So let's go ahead to that next slide. Labor trafficking victims are criminalized, but very often that's overlooked, and it's even more complicated, I think, today, especially with our immigrant population who are not going to come forward to talk about things they may have been forced to do. So, and again, acknowledging that forced criminality is labor trafficking, and then labor trafficking commonly part of sex trafficking. Let's go ahead to that next slide. Really important to remember if you're dealing with an adult client who may be mentally incapacitated, and that does actually put them in terms of being a child victim. So coercion, force, fraud not required in those instances. So something to be aware of as well. Go ahead, next slide. an eligible offense. And so there is a list of offenses in the statute that are not eligible for expungement under this statute. And those are tend to be the more violent offenses: arson, murder, robbery, that sort of thing. One of the things that has come up recently in terms of juvenile records is how often there's an aggravated battery arrest and adjudication. And apparently that is much more common than we might think about, and that is not expungible. So we're going to be working on some kind of remedy with that, because that obviously needs to be addressed. Gonna skip over. Yeah, let's just talk the nexus. So the offense or offenses that you want to expunge must have been committed while the person was a victim of human trafficking and part of the human trafficking scheme. And go ahead to that next slide. We have to be careful with what a scheme is, because sometimes courts and prosecutors who are looking at these will think that the scheme is the trafficker's way of making money, but it's not. It's the trafficker's way of controlling the victim, and that's clearly set out in federal law. So really important to make those distinctions. I won't go into what serious harm is. So go ahead and go down to general. Thank you. So yeah, no limitations on how many arrests or convictions may be expunged. You can file in multiple circuits or multiple counties at the same time. There are legal standards for judicial determination. So if you have official documentation, which would be a face sheet which says as verification, or it says it indicates that your client is verified, that would be official documentation, which we didn't get into the presumptions under the statute, but that creates a presumption that the offenses you're seeking to expunge resulted from trafficking. Without official documentation, we have a clear and convincing evidence standard, which of course is a little more difficult. Let's go on down to post-expungement concerns. And I know there are a lot of nuts and bolts with this, and I invite your questions, not just here today, but yeah, please reach out and get in touch, because there's a lot to these. Yeah, so once an expungement is granted, we know that the information has to come off of government databases, whatever agencies, DOC, whoever may have this information. You may have warrants in other counties that maybe have resulted from the record that you've expunged. So you could go to those counties and say, there's no longer a basis for that warrant, and the like. So, and let's get on down to effects of expungement, and I'll wrap it up here. So yeah, it obliterates expungement literally means to destroy. So obliterates the arrest record. The clerk seals the court file. Your client may lawfully deny the arrest with those two exceptions, and it vacates any underlying conviction. And go ahead to the next slide. Again, I mentioned it earlier, a vacature under this statute is a substantive vacature. So that means that the fines are wrapped up, the fines are gone, probation, any penalty at all resulting from that vacated record is also vacated, basically. So I want to go to effects of vacating convictions. Go down another slide, if you would. Yeah, fine refunds. So under the U.S. Supreme Court law, if you expunge a record and a conviction is vacated and your client paid in fines, and again, it's going to be on the adult side, they're entitled to a refund of those fines. That is the law of the land. We have some uneven results here in Florida in terms of how we're dealing with that. But I did just want to make one additional thing, and I'm going to close out here, that and you all know this working with commercially sexually exploited children, but with children, you don't have to have a third party trafficker, right? You can have this, the buyer of a child is the trafficker. And so any child involved in the exchange of sex with anyone for anything of value. And that is under, we're defining a victim under both state and federal law. So under federal law, the exchange of value is very, very broadly interpreted. So that can be something as simple as a promise not to do something, that sort of thing. So really important to look at those things. That's all I have today. Sorry, tried to cover a lot of ground, but I'm more than happy to answer. I may have raised more questions than I answered, but happy to talk to anyone afterward.
All right, so we do have a few questions in the chat. Before we get to the questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen to make this a little bit easier if the speakers want to turn their cameras on. This might be a good time to do it. Let's go ahead and, okay. So let me turn my video on. So I'm gonna go through the chat to make sure that we answer some of the questions. I know some of the questions that were asked in the chat were answered as we were talking. So I do want to use this opportunity to drop the link to the materials and the CLE code for anybody who might be interested. So let's go ahead and pull up the chat, and I'm going to drop it in now and I'll read it out loud. So the code is 2517494N as in Nancy. You're going to get it via email as well, and you're going to find it in the YouTube description. If you copy it, instead of typing it, make sure that you don't copy any spaces, because when you post on the Florida Bar's website, you might get an error, and it's usually because you copied a space or something. So that's the CLE code. I'm gonna go back to the chat because I know there were some comments and some questions. I want to make sure everybody has the information. There's one question from Donna that I believe Christine answered, but Christine, I think it went to the host and the panelists and did not go through the chat. So this question was asked early on in regards to safe houses. So the question is, do some safe houses, some safe house residents become exploited again and reveal the locations of safe houses? And do they recruit other children from the safe houses? We've seen those things happen in traditional teen shelters.
Well, I could address that. Safe houses, first, we don't have many safe houses. We only have 8 safe houses. And safe houses need to be distinguished from at-risk homes or group homes, at-risk group homes. And we have 100 and something at-risk group homes. At-risk group homes, those are very different. There's people run away from those homes. They share information about those homes. Safe houses have a very, very good success record. And so, because they're so limited and they're 24/7 therapy. And so it's a very different type of placement versus at-risk homes. And truthfully, I'm not seeing much positive from at-risk group homes.
All right. Anybody else wants to add anything on what Professor Paolo mentioned? I will read out the phone number that Emma mentioned earlier. She dropped it in the chat. This is for the Victim Compensation Fund. It's 800-226-6667. So I've actually added that number, the information that Emma shared, in the materials that will go out. So when you see that email in the YouTube description, that number will be right there. So it's easy to access. We have a comment on, I guess, referring to attorney ad litems, and it states, I work with attorney ad litems and we get appointed to a lot of these kiddos. This was early on during the presentation. And there's another comment, guardian ad litems represent the best interest of the child. Attorney ad litems represent the child's express interest and represent the child, as an FYI. And this question, I believe, came in during Jacqueline's session. And the question is, we can get their A number and it tells us when hearings are. I guess it's more of a comment than a question.
So yes, we did not have time to get into all the details. Part of the information that the immigration attorney will need is the A number. That is vital. it's important for everyone to understand that is only related to immigration court. So that is just one of multiple places the children could have urgent deadlines. So, for example, if the child has a case pending with USCIS, the United States Customs and Immigration Services, that's not going to show up by typing in the A number. So they could have an urgent deadline for that. They could have status expiring. But that is one important way where you can check to see, at least if they have an immigration court hearing. You do need to know the child's country of birth as listed on their paperwork. That's a new addition. So yes, that is helpful to check that, and also to collect any information with A number information or information from the government, information from shelters, etc., and get that information to an immigration attorney so that they can evaluate what options the child may have and what actions are needed to either protect the child's status or to get them status.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Here's another question, and this was probably asked during your session, Jacqueline. So, I represent parents in the dependency system. Sometimes the children are getting immigration assistance, but the parents are not, even when the parent has custody. So these children risk having their parents deported. Is anyone looking at this risk, and are there resources to help the family stay together?
So yes, it's a huge need, as all generally civil legal needs, right? There's a lot of unmet need, especially in the current environment. Very important. Anyone who is able to hire an attorney as soon as possible, or at least consult with an attorney to see if they have any options. One of the reasons why generally, for instance, my practice is I'm not going to consult with a parent with an open dependency case, because that could create a conflict so that I now have to withdraw from both cases, right? So we have to know a lot of information first to be able to consult with a parent of a child when they're in the dependency case. But yes, checking with legal aids in your community to see if they're able to at least provide a consultation. Frequently, there are organizations that provide at minimum, free or very low cost consultations, and then sometimes full representation. But it's really important for the parents to find out, do they have any options, right? Is there a status they can pursue? And if they don't, to engage in planning, right? Because they need to plan for what they're going to do. And there's a lot of, there are clinics that are helping with paperwork to make these plans, right? Who are the children going to live with? What are their plans if they are detained? So that is a big need right now. And there are organizations that are helping with making those plans as well.
There is one question that I'm going to skip to because it's related to this topic in this segment, and I'm assuming it's for you, Jacqueline, as well. So the question is, what do you do if you don't know the exact date of birth? Like, are you having two birth certificates with different dates from a country that doesn't provide certified copies?
What to do is going to depend on the case type. It's going to be challenging. There are certain types of document. Oh, so they're different. Sorry, I'll back up. It depends on what date of birth are you talking about? Like for what purposes are you going to use it, right? So what you might care about for the dependency case might be different from what is necessary for immigration purposes. So for immigration purposes, there are specific types of documents that need to be obtained. And depending on, what type of document it is, that might be the controlling document. If there is not an actual valid document, right? If it's either fraudulent or some sort of other generated document, it can create a whole host of problems, and it's going to be specific to the case, but it's likely to be a complex issue. I think there was one other question about referring folks to criminal attorneys if they have so with respect to, so anyone who is not already a U.S. citizen, and especially, we're talking about our kids in care, especially as well, with a delinquency or a criminal justice issue, and even just a charge or just an arrest, right? Even if there's not a charge, it's just an arrest, folks should be consulting with an immigration attorney. Ideally, if there's an ongoing case, ideally they're going to consult or hire an attorney who has expertise in both criminal law and immigration, or at minimum, a criminal attorney who also consults with immigration attorneys. There are immigration attorneys who specialize in this area of law, and there are some criminal attorneys that specialize in this area as well. Just a general criminal attorney or just a general immigration attorney is probably not going to be able to provide conclusive advice. But I would say for sure, not just a criminal attorney, unless that criminal attorney has expertise in immigration. Depending on what's going on with the criminal justice involvement, it might be a clear situation, or it might be one that is a grayer area, right? Or more complex and requires more legal analysis. So definitely recommend consulting if possible, either if a case is ongoing or if a case has occurred, any kind of involvement.
Okay, Jacqueline, we have one more question for you, so I'm going to keep it with you. And the question is, which organizations are helping these parents plan should they get deported? I have a parent planning to leave us. Child has SIJ with DA, and because she doesn't have anyone here, she's planning to take him with her, and he will lose all of his immigration benefits.
Yes, that is correct. If the child leaves, they will no longer have an immigration status. Maybe we can share information off the top of my head. I need to find the links and it might also vary by area. But I think there's some organizations that are doing remote planning sessions. So first check with your local immigration providers, and also I'll see if I can find that. We can maybe include it in the materials.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm gonna go back up the chat because I think there were some questions that I want to make sure were answered. One of them was for me, and the question is this webinar being recorded and it will be sent to us? The answer is yes, it's being recorded. It will be emailed within 24 hours, and I will probably be able to post it today on YouTube. So make sure to follow that FLS, the Florida Legal Services channel. You'll get notified every single time, and it also allows you the opportunity to share a lot of these webinars that we've had in the past with other folks that maybe just joined an organization. They didn't have the chance to register. So yeah, we have a lot of webinars, particularly when it comes to human trafficking. So make sure to be on the lookout for those on our YouTube channel. So I think this question about the criminal event was answered, and Lisa had asked the question that it was answered on the go. The question was, you can only expunge one criminal record, and Brent addressed this and the difference between the two types expungements. And there is one question though, an attorney is needed to vacate these cases, correct? They can't do it pro se?
So, I mean, legally they can do it pro se, but I can't even imagine unless it was the simplest of cases, highly documented, that kind of thing. Even then, navigating the process, every state attorney's office handles these differently. The courts handle them differently. It would be pretty. The solution, I shouldn't say this, probably the solution is to call us, and because we will take these cases. But yeah, it would be very difficult. I also saw that our fines removed through the expungement to allow voting. So yes, that would be the end result, assuming that all the felonies were expunged. But not because the fines are removed, but because the convictions, the felonies are removed. So the basis for that impediment is completely gone. So voting rights restored, gun ownership rights restored. Everything that was a consequence of the conviction is put back to where you were in the beginning before the conviction.
I know the next question right after that one was about labor trafficking. The question was, what about labor trafficking? And that's right when we were pulling the slide. So Lisa, if your question was unanswered, let us know in the chat because I know we're about to run out of time. There's one question here that I believe was answered, but are fines removed through the expungement to allow voting?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one I just kind of jumped to. I took your thunder there. Right. But yes.
Jorge, there are a few things in the Q&A now.
Okay, so let me pull up the Q&A so make sure we don't miss on those. Okay, so the first question is, who are those organizations, clinics that can help with family planning? Can that information be shared in the training materials and placed in the show notes on YouTube? Absolutely. So if Jacqueline or anybody else has information about these organizations or clinics, feel free to email those to me, and I'll make sure to add those to the YouTube description as suggested. And I'll also create a Google document, drop it in the material so we can list those as well. So the same thing, if anybody who's listening to this recording, if you know about an organization that we missed in those materials, feel free to email me as well. So I know, Jacqueline, I see you typing an answer, so I'm not going to mark it as answered just yet. So, okay. So the next question is, do you have a list of contact information where an attorney willing to volunteer can sign up, provide their information? Also, does any such appointment require strictly physical appearances, or is it possible for Zoom remote appearances as needed or remote work? I don't know if that question is to everybody, like, if, for opportunities to volunteer with your organizations, when it comes to private attorneys who might want to volunteer to do this type of work.
At Florida Children's First, we have the Florida Dependency Law Center, where we maintain a database of attorneys willing to do pro bono work. And so you don't strictly have to be a dependency attorney. In fact, we're looking for people like immigration attorneys or expunction attorneys or attorneys that will do that sort of work, so that if you do have a case and you need legal expertise that's outside of dependency, you can go on to that website, and I'll drop the link in there.
I just put it in.
Oh, great.
We have one more question here. Have you seen, I think this is directed to Brent, but if anybody wants to answer, feel free to answer. Have you seen any of the state attorney office expungement clinics handling the human trafficking expungements, like Orange, Dade, or Broward, for example?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with some of them. I know typically they don't, because it's different. It's not a walk up sort of thing, and survivors are generally maybe not going to those kind of things. And then if they are, it's a much more complex. It's not paperwork. And so, however, we have encouraged folks who are doing clinics to at least have someone there who can respond to those kind of things. Otherwise, there is that impression that I can't expunge my record, or I only have one shot at it, or I can't expunge it because I had a conviction, and so on and so forth. So we do like to get the word out, and would like to have a presence at those clinics.
All right, I know we're a little bit over time. Jacqueline dropped the link for floridaimmigrant.org/events. I will make sure to add these links into the materials. There's also, Robin dropped the link for Florida Dependency Law. I saw a comment from Janine, and I have to agree with it, which is, this was a great webinar, 10 out of 10, no notes, as the kids say. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Public Interest Law section, in particular the Children's Rights Work Group, for putting this amazing webinar together. I don't know if any of you were aware of this, but it's Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So this kind of goes back to, I think, what every speaker had said. I know Emma mentioned outreach and educating. Valerie also mentioned training shelters and working with the public defenders, and there was a lot of that data that Professor Annino mentioned as well. So I think a lot of times it's about creating awareness. So as we said, this is being posted on YouTube. Use this as a platform to help spread the word and create awareness. I want to take the opportunity again to thank every speaker here and everybody that joined us today. So with that said, if people want to put their thank yous in the chat, we'll make sure to share. If any additional questions that were unanswered, feel free to email me, and I'll do what I can to make sure to pass those along to the speakers and make sure that everybody gets their answers. So Christine and Robin, I'm going to pass it off to you if you want to close it out, because your work group put this together. So passing it back to you.
Just thanks for coming, everyone, and please consider joining Public Interest Law section if you're not already a member.
And I have nothing further. Just thank you for your time and attention, and thank you so much to our panelists.
Definitely.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.